In the 11th century, a philosopher and theologian named Anselm of Canterbury organized his life's work around a single Latin phrase, fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. Many readers assume this motto describes an attempt to replace faith with reason, but for Anselm, faith was a volitional state, an active drive. He already believed in God. What he sought was a rigorously mapped logical structure to support that belief. Anselm designed his proofs to be universally binding, utilizing pure reason to logically corner absolute non-believers. His ultimate skeptical target in the proslogion was a figure derived from Psalm 14, the fool, the person who has said in his heart, "There is no God." Anselm's objective was highly specific, to construct a single, unbreakable logical proof that forces the fool to concede God's existence, using nothing but deductive reasoning. He built this proof upon a specific definition of God, that than which a greater cannot be thought. Standard introductory philosophy courses often teach a simplified interpretation of what Anselm did next. This consensus reading claims Anselm argued that because a concept existing in reality is greater than a concept existing only in the mind, the greatest conceivable being must exist in reality. A contemporary monk named Ganilo recognized a flaw in that interpretation and wrote a rebuttal on behalf of the fool, famously known as the Lost Island argument. This diagram shows Ganilo's logic. If the rule that reality is greater than concept holds true, we could imagine the greatest conceivable island. By Anselm's supposed logic, this perfect island would have to exist in reality, otherwise a real island would be greater than it. Because the greatest conceivable island obviously does not exist, Ganilo concluded that Anselm's underlying reality over concept rule is fallacious. In response, Anselm did not bother refuting the Lost Island example directly. He ignored it because he rejected Ganilo's interpretation of his original logic. Ganilo was attacking a straw man. Anselm never claimed that existing in reality is universally greater than existing in the mind. His actual argument relied on a much stricter mechanism. To see Anselm's true logical architecture, we have to look at his formal text, Reply to Ganilo 8, where he relies on modal logic rather than a blanket rule about reality. This animation shows his first premise. We form the idea of a greatest conceivable being by extrapolating upward. We start from lesser, temporary goods, move to greater, everlasting goods, arriving at a concept with no limitations. The second premise introduces the core ontological distinction between contingent existence and necessary existence. Contingent existence means a subject is capable of non-existence. It exists, but it doesn't have to. Necessary existence means a subject cannot possibly fail to exist. A being capable of non-existence is logically less great than a being that cannot possibly fail to exist. This creates a logical trap for the fool. If the greatest conceivable being does not exist, it is inherently capable of non-existence. It would be a contingent thing. This means if that than which a greater cannot be thought is even a possible concept, it must actually exist. A being that could exist but doesn't is inherently capable of non-existence, making it less great than a being whose existence is necessary. If the greatest possible being is possible at all, its nature requires it to be real. The argument focuses on the inescapable mode of existence, moving beyond a simple proof of presence to one of logical necessity. Anselm's argument is a highly specific modal constraint. It proves that necessary existence is a required property of the greatest conceivable being. Once necessary existence is proven, a new problem emerges. How does Anselm determine the actual characteristics of this abstract, invisible subject? This diagram illustrates what we can call the divine attribute generating machine. Anselm takes his core formula, that than which a greater cannot be thought, and combines it with external value axioms to deduce specific traits. For example, he pulls a value intuition from the Platonic and Augustinian traditions. Being active is inherently better and greater than being passive. We plug this axiom into the central node. If the greatest conceivable being can be acted upon by outside forces, it is partially passive. We could easily conceive of a greater being that is fully active. The formula processes the axiom, and the output is definitive. The node for impassibility locks into place. Impassibility is the state of being invulnerable to suffering, external forces, or passive emotion. The subject acts but cannot be acted upon. Anselm does not need separate proofs for every single divine trait. The formula automatically deduces them by evaluating what state is logically greater. We can run the machine again using a second major axiom from the Monologion regarding the fundamental nature of time and physical space. This chart shows how time and space impose severe constraints. They partition a subject's existence into distinct, separate fractions. A physical, temporal being exists piecemeal, divided into a past, a present, and a future. This introduces divine simplicity. Whatever is composed of parts relies on those individual parts to subsist, making the whole entity fundamentally dependent on its components. Applying the logic machine to this constraint yields a clear result. The greatest conceivable being must be the ultimate independent source of its own existence. It cannot be dependent on parts. The direct consequence is that the being must be absolutely simple, meaning it possesses strictly zero parts. A secondary consequence immediately follows. Because it has no parts, it cannot be divided into fractions of time. It is therefore timelessly eternal, existing entirely outside of the flow of time. By analyzing the metaphysical constraints of greatness, Anselm logically strips away all physical and temporal limitations from his subject. Generating attributes this way exposes the system to a critical vulnerability. Do these deduced traits contradict each other? A specific paradox arises between justice and power. God is perfectly just, and therefore cannot lie. But God is omnipotent. If God can do anything, how can he be unable to lie? Anselm resolves this by carefully defining his parameters. Omnipotence is not the ability to do literally any action. He categorizes lying not as a power, but as a manifestation of weakness. Because absolute power cannot contain a weakness, true omnipotence strictly entails the inability to lie. The system remains consistent. This completed flowchart shows the entire logical architecture that Anselm constructed, built entirely from a single, self-contained sentence. Once you accept the definition of that than which a greater cannot be thought, it acts as an inescapable logical constraint. The framework forces the deductive reality of a complete, internally consistent theological system. Modern philosophers certainly dispute the specific Platonic value axioms Anselm fed into his machine, debating, for example, whether timelessness is truly greater than existing within time. But those disputes concern the inputs, not the engine itself. The argument remains one of the most rigorously consistent deductive systems in medieval philosophy. Looking at the physical stone of Beck Abbey where these texts were written, it is striking to consider the vast intellectual distance covered by one monk at a desk. Anselm achieved exactly what his motto demanded. He built a rationally inescapable blueprint of the divine, using logic to build an enduring architecture of understanding.